here in London. I'm in one of the meeting rooms in Wolf Olins, and excited to be actually live with future learners for the next half hour or so, and happy to answer, if I can, any question about anything really, but particularly related to brands. People have been sending me questions already, and you can tweet them as well, and I'll pick up and I'll answer as many questions as I possibly can. So there's a couple that have come in from people who are working for or running small businesses. Someone saying, I enrolled on this course to be able to understand how to create a killer brand and launch my personal business. The majority of what's been delivered has been based around big branding and corporate conglomerates. My question would therefore be, can these same lessons be used successfully for the little man? And someone else asks, what would be the most vital area for small or one-person organisations to focus on? I think my general answer would be that all of these principles absolutely apply to small organisations, even down to one person. And the butterfly technique, for instance, absolutely works just at the level of a single person organisation. There's an extraordinary thing in Britain called 64 Million Artists, which is a very small, not-for-profit organisation, just 2 people basically running it. And it's designed to encourage creativity in everybody. So it's really saying all 64 million people in Britain can be artists. And the 2 people running it, I know, have used recently the butterfly technique to become much clearer actually about their own individual motivations for this organisation, but also for the purpose and the brand idea for the organisation as a whole, and that's been very beneficial to them. So even right down at that level, the thinking works, and I mean the difference is going to be that a small organisation doesn't have enough people to have a brand department or a brand team, possibly even a marketing team. So it's not going to have a chance to think through all of these brand questions so systematically and in such a kind of codified way as a big organisation would. But the principles still apply. And if you want to dig into this a bit more deeply, I wrote a piece for The Guardian last week suggesting 5 things that a small business needs to think about in order to build a big brand. And I used an example of, I guess, a medium-sized business, small to medium-sized business in the north of Britain called Betty's, which runs a small chain of cafe tea rooms. And for me, is the perfect example of a small company with a big brand. And they've created a big brand, I think, in 2 ways, more than anything else. One is by just offering a fantastic product, really, really high quality food and coffee and tea and brilliant service. And it's so good that whenever you go to a Betty's tea room, there's a long queue outside and you've got to wait for a table. But secondly, through storytelling. And when you do get a table in a Betty's restaurant, you sit down, you look at the menu, the back of the menu tells you the story of how Betty's was created by a Swiss guy who came over to Britain in the last century, started the tea room, and what's special about the brand is a combination of Swiss precision and Yorkshire warmth. So it's a combination of a really brilliant product and then a story behind it that I think is the secret to building a small company brand. So I hope that kind of helps you think that one through. Someone else asks, what is the relationship between brand and packaging? At this point, I wish I had my colleague Peter, who you'll have seen in a couple of films here, because his background is in packaging and mine isn't. But when you think about product brands as opposed to corporate brands or service brands, packaging, of course, is incredibly important. And you could argue that branding started with packaging, really, that the first recognisable modern brands in the early to mid part of the 19th century were goods that for the first time were packaged and the boxes were printed, and suddenly there was imagery, and things like early breakfast cereals would be an example, or early beer brands. The Bass beer brand was the very first registered trademark in Britain. It had to have a bottle and a label on the bottle. And all of these things are packaging, and in its where branding started. And there is, I'm sure you know, a big industry of packaging designers, and it's an incredibly sophisticated both art and science. There is an art to do with imagery and colour and typography and how big or how small messages are. But there's also a really complicated science to do with the technology of packaging, which of course has changed dramatically in recent years through things like Tetra Pak and so on. But also the regulatory requirements, where certainly if you're in the European Union, there's a huge amount of nutritional and other information that you're required to put on packaging. So it's really kind of complicated science to getting all of that right. So what's the relationship between brand and packaging? I would say that packaging is possibly, for a product, it's possibly the most important expression of a brand. But also that packaging has a role in the history of branding, that it's through the really clever people who created the first packaging designs in the last century. It's through them the whole idea of branding as we recognise it now started. Someone else is asking, why is brand loyalty termed as the core of brand equity, and how does it work specifically in the hospitality industry? Brand loyalty is a really interesting subject, and for a long time it was the goal, I guess, of probably most branding activity, was to create loyalty among customers. So not only would you buy the product or the service, but you would carry on buying it, and you might even recommend it to your friends. Brand loyalty became kind of the big thing to go for. And I guess if it's the core of brand equity, then the reason for that is that it's loyalty that gives you some kind of guarantee that people will keep buying your product in the future. So loyalty gives you a brand equity that lasts into the future, and it means that your product will not just create revenues this year, but it will do next year and the year after and the year after that. And the accountants who run lots of businesses really love that thought, because they know that that their business is going to be able to generate revenue year after year after year because people are loyal to the brand. And that's probably why it's core to brand equity. Lots of questions in recent years about brand loyalty. There are lots of studies to suggest that people are generally less loyal to brands now than they were 10 years ago or 20 years ago. Certainly in my own experience, when maybe 10, 15 years ago, I would have tended to always use one supermarket for my shopping. I'm now going to move between all of them, and if somebody's got a particularly good product or a particularly good offer, I will go there. People are, I think, better informed, they're more mobile, they find it easier to move between brands. And of course, in the online world, where you can compare one product with another in a click, then it's much harder to create loyalty. People are going to shift around. And I think brands have just got to live with this fact that you are not going to create total single-minded loyalty among consumers anymore. And maybe loyalty isn't necessarily such a good thing. You think about loyalty cards, stores offer credit cards with discounts in the belief that that will make people loyal, but of course, look in anybody's wallet and they've got 20 of these loyalty cards, so where is the loyalty? We can't be loyal to everybody all at the same time. And even more cynically, somebody once said, loyalty is for dogs. Human beings are more complicated and more sophisticated in their relationship with with products and with brands than that. So I think people have multiple loyalties now, and I'm not sure that the word loyalty is the best way of describing it. Maybe commitment is a word that you could have a commitment to many different products, many different services in the same category. How does it work in the hospitality industry was the question. Hotels, I'm guessing, and the big international hotel chains are famous for their loyalty cards. I always have a bit of degree of skepticism about how effective they are. Those of you who work in the industry probably know better than I do. I'm guessing they are effective, or they wouldn't still exist. The problem I have is remembering which loyalty cards I've got, and B, remembering which hotels actually belong to which group, because it's not always obvious, what's in the Global Hotel Alliance versus what's in IHG. It's hard work for the consumer to understand all of this. But you can create a bit of a degree of loyalty through, through offering a room upgrade or something like that to a returning customer. For me, I think that real commitment, as opposed to fake loyalty, is created by the quality of the service in the hotel. And there's a hotel that we've been to several times now in the mountains in Slovakia, which happens to be in the Kempinski chain. And I do feel a lot of brand commitment to that hotel, not because I've got a loyalty card, I have, but because when we go back there, we're recognised. They know which room we like. They even know that we prefer to have only one chair rather than two chairs in the room, so they'll take one chair out before we arrive. They know that we've got preferences on pillows, and they'll provide those. And I think that's how you generate genuine commitment among customers, as opposed to sort of fake loyalty. So we are 12 minutes past the hour now, and a couple more questions through. Someone is saying, as a student in international relations, I'm particularly interested in learning more about branding strategy and conceptual tools being embraced by countries, political parties, NGOs. For example, what's the relation between a country's brand equity and its public diplomacy? Okay, so this is a really big question about place branding. Place branding is a type of branding that's emerged, I guess, in the last 20, maybe 25 years. Countries and regions and cities these days are competing with each other on a global scale to attract businesses to come and set up there, to attract tourists to come and visit, to attract people to come and live there, to attract students to come and learn there. So there is a kind of constant big live competition, and wherever there is a market, there is branding. But branding of countries is a really tricky area, because a country is really not like a corporation. It doesn't normally have a CEO. It doesn't have a line of control and command. It can't control things. And the way that a country comes across is affected by dozens, hundreds, maybe thousands of different organisations who are all out in the world in some way communicating, promoting that country. So I think the old idea maybe 20 years ago that you could treat country branding rather like any other kind of branding, that you come up with a logo and an idea behind the logo and you create an advertising campaign. I think people have largely moved beyond that. It still works a bit in the area of tourism, but more generally, if you want to try to change how the world sees your country, then that kind of very basic branding doesn't work. And I think that's where people start to talk more about public diplomacy. There's a brilliant expert on place branding called Simon Anholt. And one of the things that he says is, if you want your country to be seen to be influential, in other words, to have a kind of positive brand, then you need to do something influential. It's all about what the country does and the role it plays in the world. It's not to do with logos and slogans and advertising. It's to do with reality. Most countries will now invest a great deal in what they call public diplomacy or soft diplomacy, which is all about real stuff that has as a byproduct a brand building effect. So an example in Britain would be there's a thing called the British Council, which is a government body which operates in virtually every country around the world and helps promote British culture and British industry around the world, and also runs lots of English language schools. And the way that that works is that the thought is that every time it creates a connection between British culture or the English language and an individual in another country, then a relationship is made, and that individual is going to feel warmer about Britain, and you multiply all of those effects, and you increase Britain's brand equity, if you want to use that language, but you're doing it through lots of small, specific, real interactions rather than through some kind of grand advertising campaign. I think that's how place branding has moved on. So I hope that answers that question a little bit. Someone else here is asking a really big question. Social media. What role does social media have, and how important is it for branding? It's very difficult to measure its return on investment, its ROI, and so often clients are reluctant to invest in this area. Do you think it plays a supporting role, or has it now become as important as the core branding activities? Good question, lots of dimensions to that question. I think the answer in general is that social media is now incredibly important and is core, and there's pretty much no reasonably sophisticated business that doesn't take it very seriously and invest a lot in it. I take the point about ROI. It is very hard to measure ROI, and I think for a long time companies were a little bit shooting in the dark in this area and trying anything to see what would happen, and that still happens to some extent. But you could say, to be totally honest, that it's pretty hard to prove ROI on all sorts of branding activity. Even with advertising, it's not always easy. Sometimes you can show that an advertising campaign will increase sales of a particular product. That's an easy cause and effect to show. But the link between an advertising campaign and softer brand equity, how people feel about your brand, what the ideas they have in their minds, much harder to prove that kind of connection. So I think in general, ROI is a bit difficult to show, perhaps specifically with social media. Why is social media so important? A couple of reasons. I think one is just that it's such a pervasive part of our lives, part of culture, part of consumer culture now, that it's a central part of life, and therefore it's got to be a central part of branding. But also, I think because consumers are more sceptical now than they used to be, they're better informed, they are less loyal, as I've been saying, and they find it easier to decode advertising and to see past advertising messages. So messages that come direct from a company are a little bit discounted by consumers, not always, not everywhere, but just a bit more than they used to be. In contrast, consumers much more trust messages that they get from each other, kind of peer to peer. So what most sophisticated businesses now try to do is to use mass media like advertising or PR, public relations, to seed social media, so that people start to hear messages about them from each other, not just from the company, and they will trust those messages from each other much more. And I was struck a couple of days ago by noticing the Coca-Cola has been running a campaign that is designed to unify its four main products into one family with the idea choose happiness. It's interesting because the Coca-Cola idea used to be open happiness. I'm never quite sure what open happiness means really. But choose happiness is a much clearer thought and a much more provocative thought, because it's saying you've got a choice. You can choose happiness, or you can choose to be miserable. And lots of people do choose to be miserable. You can choose happiness, and there's some suggestion that if you choose happiness, then you'll naturally choose Coca-Cola, or if you choose Coca-Cola, then you'll choose to be happy. I don't quite know what connection is. But anyway, there's a clear, provocative hashtag. And what Coca-Cola are wanting to happen is for consumers to use that hashtag in social media towards each other. And Coca-Cola then will, and I saw this in the railway station around the corner a couple of days ago, will show a Twitter feed showing the hashtag, showing people using it. And that's kind of that's perfection for in some aspects of brand building, when you can get your consumers to be doing your communication for you using your hashtag. Not easy to do that because people are reluctant to be too kind of corporate, but it can happen. And when it does happen, it's very powerful. And I think that's the reason why social media is now absolutely central part of branding. Now, I'm just looking to see whether we've got more questions in. We are 21 minutes past the hour. Someone is saying, in the course it was mentioned about the social value of a brand. I'd like to know how something intangible like this can be measured apart from the social media statistics. Also, how can we ensure standardization in commercial value metrics? Okay, so a couple of interesting things here. This is all to do with the value or the impact of a brand and how you measure it. We suggest on this course that branding has a commercial impact, it creates commercial value, but also potentially it has a social impact and it creates social value. And you'll remember that we talked about commercial value as being all to do with its effect on getting consumers to buy things, on getting employees to essentially work harder and work in the same direction, but also in creating longer term effects where consumers become committed to a brand even if they're not loyal to it, and employees act in a way that helps build the future of the organisation. And in that way, brands can help generate increased profits, but also increased growth opportunities. And those two things together give you commercial value. Profit times growth potential is the commercial value of an organisation. So the commercial value thing, I think, is quite simple. Can you standardise the measurement of that? Tricky. As we talked about the notion that that you could put a dollar value on brands, and there are 4 agencies that do that. They will tell you what they think the Apple brand is worth in billions of dollars. And behind all of that, in theory, there is a standard method because it's created by the ISO, the International Standards Organization. So there is an international standard for brand valuation, but different people using that standard come up with wildly different answers. So in practice, I think, really difficult to standardize that. So that's the commercial side. Social value of brand is kind of even harder. And what we're suggesting in the course, and I think this is very early thinking, and it needs a lot more exploration, a lot more research, but that in principle you could look at how a brand creates or doesn't create short-term well-being and longer-term sustainability. Say, for instance, does a brand encourage people to eat healthily? That would be a short-term well-being thing. So maybe something like Innocent Drinks encourages people to drink fruit juice. But equally, does a brand tend to increase the planet's resources as opposed to depleting them? So I suppose you could argue that an electric car brand like Tesla maybe does that. Interestingly, you could argue that something like Wikipedia does, because that doesn't create physical resources, but it does create intellectual resources for the planet. to be explored more, I think, but I think you could, in principle, measure the extent to which a brand encourages behaviour that leads to well-being, and you could measure the extent to which a brand leads to behaviour that generates sustainability. So well-being in the short term, sustainability in the long term. But maybe one of you will pick that up and turn it into an international standard for measuring social impact. And just worth saying at the end that the word social gets used in two different ways, and it's important to be clear about this. What I've just been talking about is social impact in the sense of, does the brand do good for people and for the planet? That's one version of social. The other version of social is to do with social media, which is just a medium in which we communicate with each other. It's same word for two different things. And when I'm thinking about social impact, I'm thinking about impact for good or ill on people and the planet, rather than impact in social media. Hopefully that a little bit answers that question. We're coming up to the half hour. We're 26 minutes past the hour. I don't think I've got any more questions coming in. I'm just looking at my email feed now, let me just quickly check the Twitter feed to see if there's any last minute questions. Now is your chance to ask. I'm just going to, having been talking about social media, I'm going to use Twitter now to see if anything else is coming through on the FL Brands hashtag. Okay, someone is asking what's the link to the Guardian article. I'll tell you what, I'll put the link to the Guardian article in my end of week email, which will go out tomorrow, that will give you a chance to have a look and see whether you agree with my recipe of 5 things that a small business can look at, and you'll see that Betty's, my favourite big small brand, gets mentioned there as well. I don't think there's any more questions coming through. We're just coming up to 30 minutes past the hour, so that's the end of this webinar. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope those of you who've asked questions feel that they've been answered. They're really good questions, by the way, really challenging questions with lots of dimensions to them. So thank you for throwing them at me. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the course, and do keep contributing your comments as we go through, because I think that's where all the exciting action happens. It's the interaction between people that makes this course what it is. But thank you very much indeed.